In 1952, a Sumerologist named Samuel Noah Kramer was working through a collection of tablet fragments at the University Museum in Philadelphia. Most of them were administrative, grain ledgers, land transfers, temple records. Standard material. But one fragment stopped him. The cuneiform on it described a conversation. Not a prayer, not a hymn, not a royal decree. A private exchange between Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, and a single human being. The language was older than the surrounding collection. The scribe who copied it had noted in a marginal inscription that the original source was a temple record from Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian history, a city the Sumerians themselves said was founded before the flood, before the kings, before almost everything. Kramer published a partial translation. He flagged the fragment as significant. And then the wider academic community moved on, because what the tablet described didn't fit the narrative they had already agreed on. If ancient history like this keeps you up at night, subscribe and hit the bell. This channel goes to the places most people aren't willing to look. Before we get into the tablet, you need to understand who Enki actually was inside the Sumerian worldview. Not the cartoon version, not the New Age version. The actual figure the Sumerians documented across thousands of tablets over thousands of years. Enki's full name in the oldest text is Nudimmud, which translates as the one who fashions or the maker of forms. He was the god of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean the Sumerians believed existed beneath the ground. He was the god of Me, a Sumerian term that modern translators usually render as divine laws or cosmic principles, but which in the original cuneiform carries a more precise meaning. The Me were the actual instructions governing how things functioned. They were described as physical objects that could be held, carried, and even stolen. They were not metaphysical abstractions. They were more like what we would call code. Programs. Instructions that governed the behavior of everything from agriculture to kingship to death itself. Enki held the Me. He kept them in the Abzu. And according to the Sumerian record, he was selective about who received them. The dynamic between Enki and Enlil, the two most powerful figures in the Sumerian pantheon, runs through virtually every major Sumerian narrative. Enlil is the god of wind and kingship, the administrative head of the divine hierarchy. He makes broad decisions, issues mandates, sets policy. Enki operates differently. He works from below, literally and figuratively. He builds things. He engineers things. He intervenes quietly in situations where Enlil's decisions would produce outcomes Enki considered wasteful or unjust. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives we possess, describes Enlil deciding to destroy humanity entirely because their population had grown too loud. Enki's response is not to challenge the decree publicly. He finds a way around it. He speaks to a wall. He instructs a single man through a reed screen, technically without violating the decree by speaking to a human directly. That is the pattern. That is who Enki is inside the Sumerian system. The one who tells you something through indirect means. The one who leaves you the information you need without appearing to have given it to you. And the Philadelphia fragment is the clearest surviving example of that pattern operating at its earliest recorded moment. The location. The tablet places the meeting at Eridu. Eridu is real. It is the oldest continuously occupied site in southern Mesopotamia, dating back to approximately 5400 BC. The Sumerians consistently described it as the first city, the city that was given kingship from heaven before any other. Eridu was Enki's city. His temple there, the Yabzu, was built on top of a freshwater spring. Archaeologists excavating the site found something that surprised them. Beneath the main temple, going deeper into the ground, there were 17 successive layers of earlier temples, each one built directly on top of the last. The oldest layers reached down to the 6th millennium BC. Each layer contained evidence of ritual activity, of burning, of offering. At the base level, so deep that the excavators were surprised anything survived, there were fish bones. Enki's sacred animal was the fish. Whatever began at Eridu, it began before the Sumerians as we know them, and it began in connection with Enki specifically. The tablet locates the meeting inside the Yabzu, in a room described as the place where the water speaks. The scribe notes that the meeting was not attended by other gods. There were no witnesses from the divine council. What Enki said in that room was said to one person, described in the tablet only as the one who was chosen to remember. That phrase is important. The Sumerian word used there is not the standard word for a priest or an initiate. It is a compound term that appears in only a handful of other tablets in the entire surviving corpus, always in contexts that involve the preservation of something that was at risk of being lost. It is a word for a carrier, not a receiver. Someone given something specifically because they would not keep it for themselves. What Enki told humanity about its own design. The surviving portion of the tablet begins mid-conversation. Whatever came before the fragment we have is gone. What remains starts with Enki making a statement that the translation renders as the thing inside you was not made by the earth. He is speaking to the human across from him, and he is telling them something about their own construction. The Atrahasis epic describes humanity as having been created from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god, specifically the blood of a god called Wila, who was killed precisely for this purpose. The blood, according to the text, provides the atemu, the spirit, the part of the human being that outlasts the physical body. The clay provides the form. The combination creates something that neither clay nor divine blood produces on its own. A being capable of labor, yes, but also a being carrying inside it something from a much older source. The Philadelphia fragment picks up on this specific point. Enki is not telling the human they are special in a flattering sense. He is informing them of a liability. He says, in the translation Kramer noted but did not fully publish, that the part of you that comes from the old blood will not end when the body ends, and the system built for you was not designed to benefit that part. He is describing the architecture of the human afterlife. And he is describing it as something that runs against the interest of the consciousness it processes. This maps directly onto what the Atrahasis texts and later Babylonian sources say about why humanity was created. Not as companions. As workers. The Atemu, the surviving spirit, was part of the worker. It needed to be cycled. The system that cycled it was not designed with the worker's freedom in mind. What makes this fragment different from every other Sumerian text we have is that Enki is not speaking in ceremonial language. He is not delivering a hymn or an invocation. The grammar in the surviving section is the grammar of practical instruction. Direct address. Short clauses. The register of someone explaining a technical problem to someone who has to understand it quickly and completely. Scholars who have looked at the syntax note that it most closely resembles the language used in Sumerian medical texts and craft manuals. The language of someone who works with their hands, describing to another person how something actually functions. Not how it is supposed to appear, how it actually functions. The warning Enki gave. The section of the tablet that follows the design disclosure shifts in tone. Enki stops describing and starts instructing. This is consistent with his character across every other Sumerian text. He does not just inform. He equips. He tells the human in front of him three things. The first is about memory. He says that the process humans go through after death is designed to erase. That each stage of the passage through Kur, the Sumerian underworld, removes something. And that the only defense against that removal is awareness held before the passage begins, not during it. During is too late. The capacity to hold awareness through the dying process has to be cultivated while the body is still functioning. He describes this as the one preparation that cannot be rushed. The scribe records Enki repeating this point twice on the same column of clay, which in Sumerian scribal convention indicates something the speaker considered critical enough to say again. Not for emphasis in the rhetorical sense. For the practical reason that the listener was going to need to remember it under conditions that worked against remembering. The second is about knowledge. Enki tells the human that the me he has kept in the Abzu were not kept there arbitrarily. They were kept there because their dispersal to the general human population was prohibited by the council. The me governing certain areas of knowledge, specifically the understanding of how the human being was made and what the human consciousness actually is, had been classified. Restricted. Not because humanity was incapable of receiving them, but because a population that understood its own construction would be significantly harder to manage. He is not saying this metaphorically. He is saying it in the direct, practical language of an administrator describing a policy decision made by a body he was outvoted in. The Sumerian word the scribe uses for the council in this passage is the same word used in the Atrahasis epic when the senior Anunnaki vote on whether to destroy humanity. It is a governance term, a decision-making body with formal authority. Enki is telling this human that there was a vote, that the vote went against them, and that he is in this room, in this temple, at this hour, specifically because he disagreed with the outcome. The third thing Enki tells the human is the most carefully worded passage in the surviving fragment. He says that he cannot change what the council decided. He cannot give the me publicly. He cannot alter the design of the death process or the structure of Kur. But he can give the instructions for navigating the design to specific individuals who carry them forward. The Sumerian term he uses for these individuals is a compound word that translates most accurately as the ones who hold the thread. The ones who remember what they are and pass the memory on. This is, in the plain reading of the text, the origin of the mystery school tradition. Not as a mystical phenomenon, as a practical one. Enki, unable to change the system, creates a maintenance protocol for humans who can navigate it. He gives the map to one person. That person gives it to the next. The chain persists because the information in it is too specific and too dangerous to commit to public writing. What this looks like across other traditions. The thread Enki described does not disappear after Sumer. It surfaces in fragments across every major ancient tradition that followed, and when you read those traditions knowing what the Philadelphia fragment says, the connections stop looking like coincidence and start looking like transmission. The Egyptian Hermetic tradition, texts attributed to Thoth, called Hermes Trismegistus in the later Greek tradition, describes a body of knowledge passed from a divine figure to a single human recipient with the explicit instruction to preserve it and transmit it selectively. The Emerald Tablet, the most condensed surviving piece of that tradition, opens with a phrase that in its oldest Latin translation reads as follows: true, without falsehood, certain and most true. It is a document that begins by insisting on its own accuracy, which is exactly the kind of opening you would write if the thing you were preserving had been dismissed, buried, or suppressed everywhere it had previously appeared. The Pythagorean tradition in Greece required initiates to take an oath of silence about the inner teachings. The outer school received mathematics and music theory. The inner school received something else, something never written down. The same structure appears in the Eleusinian mysteries, in the Orphic tradition, in the Essene communities at the Dead Sea. An outer body of publicly acceptable religious practice. An inner body of knowledge passed mouth to ear. The specific content of these inner traditions was never committed to text precisely because the people carrying it understood that text could be seized, destroyed, and reclassified. Which is exactly what happened to the me. Enki could not give them publicly, so he gave them personally. Why this meeting was buried. Eridu was abandoned around 2000 BC. The reason the archaeological record gives is rising soil salinity from irrigation. The land became too salty to farm and the population relocated north. That is the conventional explanation, and it is almost certainly partially true. But Eridu's temple was deliberately decommissioned. The Iabzu was not simply abandoned. It was ritually closed. Offerings were buried inside the walls. The sacred items were interred rather than moved. Whatever happened at Eridu, the ending of it was intentional. The tablet tradition in Mesopotamia was extensive and systematic. Libraries were maintained by temple institutions with careful cataloging. The fact that a private conversation between Enki and a human was recorded at all is itself unusual. Official Sumerian records do not typically document divine conversations that contradict the established divine hierarchy. This fragment survived because it was copied into a larger collection at some point in its transmission, probably at Nippur, probably by a scribe who understood what they were copying and chose to preserve it inside a larger archive where it would be harder to identify and remove. It was hiding in the administrative record the same way Enki hid his instructions inside ambiguous speech, inside indirect means, inside a conversation with a wall rather than a man. The tablet does not resolve. Enki gives the 3 pieces of instruction, and then the fragment ends. Whether the original tablet continued is unknown. Whether the humans sitting across from Enki in the Iabzu at Eridu understood the full weight of what they were being told, the tablet does not say. What it does say, in the final legible line before the clay breaks, is something the scribe chose to record as the last statement. In translation, it reads as close to this as the surviving text allows. He said, "I cannot protect you from the system. I can only tell you what it is." That sentence survived 6,000 years of burial, fire, collapse, and institutional neglect. It survived because someone thought it was worth preserving. Because what Enki told that single human in a room at the bottom of a temple built over a freshwater spring is still true. The system is still running. The me are still restricted. And the thread he started in that room, passed from one carrier to the next across every tradition that followed, is still the only map we have. The fragment Kramer worked with in 1952 passed through several institutional hands after his death, and its current location is not publicly documented in the standard museum databases. The secondary notes, the ones that preserve the more sensitive passages, circulate among a small group of researchers who have continued the work without institutional support. The information in it is not comfortable, but it is specific. And specific is what you should demand from anyone asking you to reconsider what you know about human history. Drop a comment telling me which of the 3 things Enki told that human you think matters most. Subscribe if you are not already here. There is a lot more to cover.